The ESCOM board, the chair, had just informed the senior management that Mr. Moroka was no longer the CEO. And I was not there, and I was not listening in, or I was at my office, and I got a telephone call from the president. And he was really furious. He was shouting at me. And he said, what do you think you're doing? Saying a little bit stronger. And I said, what? He said, Moroka, you've got to stop it. Tell them that they've got to stop now. And I said, but President, they...
I'm sorry, just go back to that sentence. Tell who to stop
the board, that they must stop now.
Oh, okay.
I tried, to speak, to reason, to find out what it was all about. He said, I don't have time. I'm in transit through the country. I'm on my way to Mozambique. You can call me, like in half an hour's time or whatever, and we can discuss further. I tried to phone him, and he just never answered my calls.
When you say him, you're referring to the president, the ex-president?
Yes.
Yes.
I informed, that was the ex-president, yes.
This was still on 5 November.
Yes. This was as the processes were unfolding in ESCOM. I spoke to the deputy president, who was the acting president at the time. And I said, I've been given an instruction from a president of the country to stop a process. And short of just defying him, I'm bound to it was a very confusing situation. I think it's very difficult when a president just issues an instruction. And I didn't have any knowledge if the president had any further matters which he could not disclose with me, that, I had no insight into why this instruction was being issued. So I phoned Mr. Gotzel, and I said to him, I've just received this call from the president, and he's saying that this process must be stopped. And Mr. Gotzel said, but we're in the midst of the process. I've just informed the senior management. We're shortly going to go before the media. What do I say? And I said, I honestly don't understand it. And he said, well, if this is the president's giving this instruction, we can't ignore it. So he then cancelled the media briefing.
Yes. Were you able to arrange the meeting with the president in order to address these issues surrounding Mr. Moroka?
Well, it was... Then everything went absolutely ballistic. From Parliament to every commentator, it became the story of the day. Who is it? This is ESCOM. Who is the CEO? Who isn't the CEO? Why are we called to a press briefing? Why is the minister not informing us who is the CEO? Why is the board quiet? It was a complete and utter nightmare and should never have taken place. I requested to see the president, and finally, I was told that I could meet with him on the morning of Friday, the 6th of November, at his official residence. He gave me 10 minutes there. He said he hasn't got time. He's going to a meeting, NEC meeting or something, and he will meet with me at lunchtime.
I'm sorry, Ms. Hogan. Is it correct that at the time that the former president gave you that instruction, Deputy President Motlanthe was acting president? Is that correct?
That is correct. And you know, that places anyone in a dilemma because actually the president of the country is President Motlanthe at that time, as an acting president. And, you know, it threw me, it threw the board, it threw all of us into dilemmas where you did not want to be disrespectful to a president. But you know, the issues were so profound from a constitutional point of view that you didn't have time to even think this through.
Yes, you are still relating the 10 minutes that you were offered by the president in the meeting of the 6th of November. Did you discuss all the issues that you wanted to discuss with the president?
The president merely said that, you know, that he would meet with me for a fuller meeting at lunchtime.
I'm sorry. I've just been given a note by my registrar that when we started, the person who is in charge of the transcript wasn't in his place, and that there was no recording happening until he walked in. I suspect that means there is some evidence that was lost, but I suggest that what we do is we proceed, and then at a certain stage, somebody must listen to the evidence as recorded and see what we may have lost, and then we can cover it later on. Would that be fine, Mr. Mgwen?
That would be fine, Mr. President.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I did indicate to Ms. Hogan that she's very strong. Since she has commenced her evidence, either we get the lights out or the chair gets stuck in the lift, and now is the transcription. She must be very powerful.
I'm one crisis of energy.
I don't think that she will take responsibility for all of those things. Okay, thank you. Let's proceed.
Yes, and then did you finally meet
I'm
with the
sorry
president?
again.
Yes, when I met with the president at breakfast.
I'm sorry again. You talked about the lights going out yesterday, but I do feel like there is no echo now. I don't know whether everybody feels it seems to be quite warm.
That is the fourth reason why I'm saying that she's very powerful.
Those the relevant technicians should attend to that, but we don't want too much, we don't want it to be too cold, please. Okay, all right, thank you. Let's proceed.
So I had a 10-minute slot with the president at his official residence. He said he couldn't meet with me longer and that he would meet with me at lunchtime, you know, during the NEC meeting or whatever it was that he was attending in Kempton Park. I then went to Kempton Park and I got no call to see the president at all. And it really was very bad because that was the only story that was really out there in the public domain. And the consequences for Eskom, you know, ratings agencies, not that we are governed by them, but, you know, this is a company that was facing real financial constraints. It didn't need this kind of turmoil.
Did you finally meet the president?
Yes. I was, I registered my disapproval with Jesse Duarte, who was in the president's office, and various people that I wasn't getting to see him, and it was urgent. So finally on the Sunday, I met with him at lunchtime, and he said, this is the deal.
That would have been what date now? Sunday?
Sunday the 8th.
The 8th of November, 2009.
Yeah, 2009. And I met with him and he said, this is the deal. He said, I will confirm Moroka back as the CEO. He will come back to his office and he will then write his story and the board will write their story, and then I, as a minister, will determine the merits of each case.
And how did you react to that?
So the approach of the former president was, let Mr. Moroka write his version about this issue of him offering to resign, allegedly, and let the board write their version on the issue of Mr. Moroka allegedly offering his resignation. And then you, as the minister in charge of public enterprises, would look at the two versions and decide. That's what he was saying to you?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
I was not happy with that, and I explained my concerns about that it didn't really advance us much further, and, how could I adjudicate something like that? But I said, if that was the president's view, I was not going to convey that as my view to the board or to Mr. Moroka. If the president wanted that kind of instruction, he himself should take ownership of that instruction. Bear in mind, I was mindful of just the executive authority of a minister, of a president, and I felt under these circumstances, I could not assume responsibility for an act which I felt fell out of the purview of my executive authority. So the president agreed. So we agreed that I would speak to the board, who was sitting waiting to meet with me at a hotel in Johannesburg, and I would convey it as a president's decision, not my decision, and he would meet with Mr. Moroka.
Yes.
So when you said to him that you would want him to take ownership of the proposal that he was making, what you meant was that you didn't want to go to Mr. Moroka and the board and put this as your proposal.
Yes.
You wanted to be able to tell Mr. Moroka and the board that this is the proposal from the president, or instruction, whatever it was.
Yes, because, I would be implicating myself in terms of that instruction because I felt that instruction was invalid in terms of my powers and authority. I could not just issue a thing saying, Mr. Moroka comes back, this gets what done, whatever. It would really be interfering with a board process and a process of a CEO.
Yes, flowing from that answer, on paragraph 77, line number 2, you say that he really, meaning that the president, he really did not want to discuss anything. He just informed me that he had decided that Mr. Moroka will return to ESCOM over a period of time. And then you proceed with the lines in which you have now discussed with the chair. But what I want to know is that at the time when the president told you that, was he aware that the board had already decided and accepted Mr. Moroka's
Oh, yes.
resignation?
Oh, yes, he was completely aware of that.
Let's go back just a step to what Mr. Mkwena just read from your statement to you. Can I hear that coming from you? Can you just speak naturally, that exchange?
I met with the president at the venue in which he was, at which the meeting was taking place, and he just sat down and he said, "This is the deal." You know, I was wanting to discuss the merits. You know, I wanted to understand why he had issued an instruction that the process must be halted. He was just wanting to discuss the deal.
Now, part of the reason why I said I wanted to hear that coming from you is that from what Mr. Mokoena read, it appears that you say in the statement that he said, "I've decided." So you hadn't put it that way.
Yeah.
So I want to know if that's what he said. "I've decided.
Yes.
This is the deal."
Yeah, he just informed me, this is the deal.
Okay, all right, continue.
What the chairperson is trying to get out of your mouth is not that this is the deal. What exactly did the president say to you? Did he say to you that I have decided Mr. Moroka will come back, or did he simply say that this is the deal?
Well, he informed me that this is the deal. That's what I understand, you know, this is his decision.
And you see, some of the things you might have a different appreciation of them, and we as lawyers and judges might have
okay.
different, you know,
okay.
understandings of them, and sometimes you might not understand why we particularly want to hear certain aspects. But one of the issues that arise is whether what he put to you was put to you as subject to Mr. Moroka and the board accepting the proposal, or it was put to you as, "That's it. Take it or leave. They must take it or leave it." I want to understand whether this was a proposal, or this was take it or leave it. Or there might not have been enough time to understand those nuances.
I wasn't sure, but the fact that we had agreed that I would inform the board and he would inform Mr. Moroka probably leads me to believe that this hadn't been discussed beforehand, and he was first informing me, but this was what he wanted done.
And you told the president that he must take ownership of that proposal, and what then happened?
He was happy to do that, and we agreed that I would inform the board, but inform them that it was his instructions and that he would call Mr. Moroka and inform Mr. Moroka.
Did you meet with the board?
Yes, I met with the board later that afternoon.
And what was the board's reaction to that?
The board was...
And I'm sorry, maybe before you tell us about the board, you said that you had difficulties with playing the role that the president was proposing you should play in the resolution of the dispute. And you said that was because of your awareness of your executive authority and so on. Can you please elaborate more on that before we get to hear what the board said?
In terms of corporate governance in a company, the relationship between the CEO and the board is one of accountability. And as a minister, as a shareholder, it is, you know, the corporate governance framework does not allow the shareholder now to intervene in that relationship, and you can try and mediate and sort out things, but you can't make a decision about what must now take place. And I felt that the president was trying to put me in a position where I would now give an instruction which I knew the board absolutely did not agree with. And that I was forcing a board to take on a decision which they had made very clear to me that they were not happy with. So I said to I conveyed this to the president, you can't interrupt, a process. And I said, if that be the case, then this must be seen to be a presidential instruction, not my instruction. And he agreed.
I would imagine, and you must just tell me what you think, I would imagine that how strongly the board felt about the correctness of their view, and how strongly Mr. Moroka may have felt about the correctness of his view should not have been a factor on whether or not you should play that role. I'm mentioning that, and you must just give me your comment. I'm mentioning that because isn't the position that when you are in a leadership position, you have to take sometimes decisions that people will be unhappy with? Assuming it's a role that in law you could play.
Assuming that it was a role in the law that I could play, I did play that. I met with Mr. Moroka. I asked my deputy minister to meet with him. I spent hours and hours with him. I offered him mediation. I offered him arbitration. He was insisting that I affirm that he is the CEO, and that I could not do. Because the board had informed me, each individual board member had informed me that that was not the case. And it would be very indelicate of me to have then intervened in a process of saying, no, Mr. Moroka is still the CEO. Despite what you told me, he is still the CEO.
If legally you had the authority to play that role, are you saying that you would still not want to play that role just because the board felt strongly and you might have to make a finding that they would be unhappy about?
It's a hypothetical situation that you're posing to me. From a corporate governance point of view, when a relationship between a board and a CEO has broken down irretrievably, as I was a witness to, the shareholder, I think, would seldom want to intervene and tell the board, this must happen even though you're not happy with it. It wouldn't have a good outcome for the company from a fiduciary point of view to impose someone that the board felt they did no longer have the confidence in. So hypothetically, I was never presented with that situation, but hypothetically, after having consulted each individual board member and ascertained their views, I would have been reluctant to have moved in there and said, this is how it goes, because what I could see down the line is that Eskom, in trying to resolve the immense operational and financial problems that were facing them, that these would continually be a site of contestation, given the lack of a harmonious relationship at that time. So I didn't think it was solving the problem. The problem had to be resolved satisfactorily, not in a way of just insisting this and nothing else.
Your preference that that dispute be resolved by an outsider, a mediator, arbitrator?
Well, my preference was that the matter should have been resolved satisfactorily when it arose between the board and the CEO. When the CEO contested that, I then had suggested various deadlock-breaking mechanisms that are available in terms of the Labour Relations Act and whatever, mediation, all sorts of things to try and sort that out. But Mr. Moroka simply would not go along with that. And so my preference then was for the board, given that I as a minister had gone to as far as I could in those circumstances, as I saw in terms of my discretion, as far as I could, I then said to the board, they must now handle this process going forward. My attempts at mediating this conflict is certainly not working.
Oh, so, in other words, your position at the time that the then president made his proposal or decision, your position was that the resolution of this matter should be left to the board.
And in later, during the two judgments, Mr. Moroka went to court on these issues and on appeal. And both courts held that the CEO position, although the minister has authority to appoint at an AGM the CEO at Transnet, in effect, the employment contract is with the board. And therefore, it's not with the minister, and therefore the minister does not have the powers to intervene in that employment contract. And in fact, that was the advice that was given me by Michael Katz, the senior counsel, when I first met with him when this all blew up. He said there are two aspects here. One is Mr. Moroka's position as a director and Mr. Moroka's position as a CEO. So the courts confirmed my position on that.
But your position at the time that the former president spoke to you and said you must decide which version is correct, in effect, your attitude was, let's leave this matter to the board to do what it believes it should do.
Yes.
Yes.
But I undertook to convey and to try and persuade the board to go along with the president's decision on this matter. I wasn't trying to stop him, but I wanted it to be conveyed that this was a presidential decision, not my decision.
Does that suggest that if the board and Mr. Moroka had accepted this proposal, if it was a proposal, does that suggest that you would have been prepared for purposes of having finality on this matter to play the role that had been suggested by the former president?
Yes, because the board had consented to that process then.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can we now move to what was the reaction of the board? Remember that you have now had the meeting with the president. He has conveyed what he has conveyed to you. And you met with the board, what was the board's reaction?
So I met with the board. Of course, it was Sunday. They were anticipating that on Monday they would have to, speak to South Africa and explain who was the CEO and what was going on and whatever. And I conveyed the president's view of how this must be resolved. They were dismayed. And I had to do a lot of persuasion and talking through and whatever. And Bobby Gotzel then said, look, in the view of the fact that the president is trying to resolve this matter, we will take it in good faith that he is, but on one condition, that we meet with the president ourselves and put forward our point of view on this matter.
Did the board meet with the president?
They did. They went ahead and arranged for them to meet with the president later that afternoon. They met with the president, and the president had met, well, I was uncertain because I was told that the president had previously met with Moroka, but I know that the president at a certain stage met with Mr. Moroka.
Now, what I want to know is that if the board, before I go there, what was the outcome of that meeting? What was the agreement between the board, if any, with the president? In that
Yes, the board said that they would go along with that process on condition that when Mr. Moroka is reaffirmed as a CEO, that he immediately takes leave. Because it was creating problems in the organization, him, in the office, no one understanding from the staff who is now running the organization and whatever. And so the president agreed to that.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Mokwana, just for the sake of completeness, were you present at that board meeting, the meeting of the board with the president, or not really?
No, I felt that the president needed to meet with the board
Yes.
without my intervention.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
But were you informed as to what transpired at that
Well, yes, the board then came back and later that evening, and we met because we then had to discuss the modalities of how this is conveyed to the public, how it's conveyed to the senior management, how we take this process forward to diffuse a really confusing situation.
Yes.
Before you finalize, I think the question that I asked caused some problem between you and Mr. Mokwena. I think he was still wanting to establish from you in terms of what was reported to you by the
Okay.
board, the
Yes.
full extent of what was agreed between the board and the president. You have said that one aspect was that Mr. Moroka would take special leave or something, but I think you had not said as to what would then happen in his absence, or until
He would take
when
special leave
that
in
special
order.
leave would be.
Yeah, sorry, I interrupted you.
Sorry, or until when, how long that special leave would be, and what would happen in the meantime?
He would take special leave in order to prepare his statement to me. And the board equally would produce a statement, but the board wanted him not to be in office until the issues of whether he stays on as CEO was properly resolved.
What I fail to understand and what brings confusion on this aspect of the evidence is that if the board believed that their decision was correct and that they were acting in the best interest of ESCOM at the time, and they've made a decision, why did they agree with the approach which was proposed by the president?
I cannot speak for the board, so I can't exactly say what was the motivation. I know that I had to engage very robustly
Yes.
with the board because the board was not happy with this decision. But finally, as Mr. Gottsel said, the president is trying to resolve this matter. It would be disrespectful of us not to take the president's views into consideration. And therefore, we are all trying to resolve this very difficult matter. And so therefore, we will take the advice of the president, and this is what we will do.
So it seems to have been a way of reaching some compromise by effectively making a suggestion of something else that should be incorporated into the president's proposal. The president's proposal did not originally include that Mr. Moroka should take special leave.
Yes.
But they made that suggestion to the president that if you include this as part of the proposal, we would accept.
Correct.
Okay.
I understand the issues of respect and how the board wanted this issue to be resolved. I'm asking this question simply having in mind the duties and obligations, of the board members, with reference obviously to the company law and the PFMA, that they've taken a decision, they've resolved.
Sorry, could you just speak a bit in the mic? It's going, the sound is going, sorry.
Yes, I'm saying that I was asking this question, having in mind the duties of the board members in terms of the PFMA, their obligations in terms of the Companies Act. They've taken a decision where they have actually accepted a resignation. I take it that it was in terms of a resolution of the board. Now, how does one deal with the proposal post facto of the president whereby Mr. Marocha has to come back? That's what I was trying to interrogate with you.
Yes. You know, they accepted it. There was a lot of reservation. They accepted it in good faith. But they were not happy. But, you know, the one condition was that he doesn't come back to office because it's too confusing.
And then do you know as to why did Mr. Bobby Kotzel resign?
Well, as the board had come back and reported to me about their discussions with the president, and as we were having discussions on the way forward about how this process would now evolve, I got a telephone call from the president to say that Mr. Marocha, you know, the deal is off because Mr. Marocha does not accept it. That
Did not accept the proposal.
Yes, the proposal, that he be placed on leave.
He still wanted simply to be affirmed as the CEO and didn't want to take special leave.
And at that point, you know, I remember one board member just, you know, the board was furious, and this board member said, you know, who is he to think he's got these powers to do this to us? You know, Mr. Marocha, who does he think he is? And then the board was really angry because they themselves, against their better judgment, had gone along with this process in order to try and resolve a situation that was not good for the country or for Eskom. At that point, Mr. Gotzel said, I'm now resigning. I can take no further responsibility for this. The other board members were wavering whether they should resign or not, and my understanding is that they felt they would go on and we would have to try and resolve the situation. It was enormously embarrassing for me as a minister.
I'm sorry, before you proceed, when the president called you while you were getting a report from the board and said Mr. Marocha was not accepting the proposal, did he put forward what should then happen in the light of that?
No, he just said the deal was off.
Okay.
Mr. Marocha does not accept it.
In the context of that answer, you also say in paragraph 80 that you had a heated argument with the president on this matter. Are you able to share with us the details of that debate? Paragraph 80, 80.
No, well,
Page
that
19.
is the following day.
Yes.
The following day, I was going to Eskom. I was en route to Eskom.
Okay, I'm sorry, before the following day. For the rest of that day, is there anything of importance that happened?
Well, this was already past midnight. Remember, I'd spoken to the president at lunchtime. There'd been meetings with the president in Pretoria, discussions going forward. So the board had, you know, we had all stayed awake right until very late at night.
Had Mr. Gotzel withdrawn after saying he was resigning, or did he still stay on and not implemented his
No,
decision?
he said he was resigning. Mr. Gotzel had earlier, in that confrontation with Mr. Marocha before me, said that the stress of the situation of being chaired Eskom had caused him to have shingles. It had affected him physically, not only just mentally. And I could see that he just saw no way forward on this matter.
So he withdrew from the meeting after saying he was resigning or not? So did you go on without him with the board?
I can't remember.
You can't remember?
Yeah,
Okay.
But he didn't, I can't remember him trying to influence. Anyway, we then decided that we would meet the next morning to discuss how, what was going to be conveyed, how we were going to manage this. We were left once again without a decision. So en route there, the president phoned me.
That is now the following day.
The following day.
The 9th?
Yes.
Okay.
On the following day, I was en route to the Eskom headquarters when I received a phone call from the president to say that he had given Mr. Moroka permission to return as the CEO of Eskom. Of course, we had a heated discussion on that.
Yes.
Well, tell us about the heated discussion.
Well, I said, Mr. President, that is not going to solve anything. And you're now using your authority above the board to resolve this matter, and this is not going to solve any problem. Nevertheless, he said, I have given him the permission to go back as CEO of the board.
Now, when the ex-president said that he had given Mr. Moroka permission to return to Eskom, do you know whether he had engaged with the cabinet before he had actually given that instruction?
No, this was a weekend.
And do you know whether did he at least engage with the board prior to him giving Mr. Moroka that decision to return back?
No, he had spoken to me. This was the first the board had heard of it.
Now, may I also refer you to, on the same paragraph, you are talking about we are saying that on the same day, if you look on paragraph 80, I think it's the fourth line, you say that on the same day, 9 September, you meant it should be amended to say November, am I right?
Yes. It's the 9th of September, on the same day, 9th of September.
No. If you look at the top, the first line, it says
Yes.
9th November, 2009.
No, this is 9th of November. Yes, it's 9th of November.
Now,
not
when you
September.
say the same day,
Yes.
it should be the 9th of November, not September.
Correct,
Am I right?
correct.
If
What
we may-
paragraph is that?
It's paragraph 80,
The
page 19.
Yeah,
Oh, okay, so
it's the 9th of November, yes.
we'll correct that. Thank you.
It should read, Mr. Chair, on the same day, the 9th November 2009,
Yes.
Mr. Moroka arrived at Eskom, accompanied by Jimmy Manye and a few others, and went upstairs to his office. Now,
Let her tell us about that.
Yes.
Let's hear it from her.
Yes. I was not there at the time because after I'd received that information, I returned to my office. And
I'm sorry. You were en route to Eskom headquarters?
but once the president had,
Yes.
indicated that Mr. Moroka was to return, I returned to my office.
Yes.
I needed
Now-
to consult with my staff, but there was some of my staff members already there at the offices because they were awaiting, to give me advice and whatever on the process going forward. So I was informed that a small posse of people kind of accompanied Mr. Moroka through the building, into the lifts and up to his office, and that Mr. Manye was part of that. That, I understand, is incorrect, so I withdraw that. Mr. Manye had a lot to say about this via the Black Management Forum and, the persecution. Once again, I was being accused of persecuting a black executive. But I'm quite happy to withdraw that Mr. Manye was part of that posse. I checked with Eskom itself, the chair of the board, who was later the chair of the board, and he says it was a NUMSA collective that escorted Mr. Moroka back to his offices.
that is the reason why I was reading that part of the statement, in order to refer you to the second file of Exhibit L. If you may turn to page 634. You will
So in effect, you are saying, to the extent that your statement in paragraph 80 includes that Mr. Manyi was there when Mr. Marocha returned to ESCOM, that is not correct. Mr. Manyi was not there.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So as it relates to the sworn affidavit of Mr. Manyi, which was submitted to the commission, you'll see that on page 634, he in fact dispute your paragraph 80, and that is as per paragraph 3 of that affidavit. So
Correct.
that's exactly that we are saying that we were mistaken about
Yes,
that.
yes.
Let's go back to the telephone call from the president when you were en route to ESCOM. Did what the president tell you then what was your understanding of what the way forward was then?
I had no understanding. It was part of the reason why I wanted to go back to my office to discuss this matter through with my deputy minister and others, because this was now a very serious crisis.
But on the face of it, it seems to me, and you are free to comment, it seems to me that unless you tell us something else that happened that might have a bearing on this, it seems to me that what you were told on the phone by the former president amounted to saying Mr. Marocha was going to continue as CEO of ESCOM, and there was nothing really to be done about, as far as the president was concerned, about the board's view that he had offered to resign and that accepted that. But having said that, I think I must say that should not necessarily mean that he didn't have in mind that the board could do whatever it considered it had a right to do. In other words, if it decided that it would dismiss him, it may well be that he was not excluding that. But what he said to you just does seem to say, look, Mr. Marocha will continue as CEO, and then the board must decide whether they accept that or they decide to do whatever they decide.
That is one possibility, certainly. Another possibility is that the board would resign. And I'd seen the exasperation of the board members, and that would have been an even further disaster.
Of course, you must be right that there would be a risk that if the board was not prepared to accept that Mr. Marocha was to continue as CEO, and that they would therefore see this as the president's taking the side of Mr. Marocha, that they could then resign. That must
Yes.
have been a logical possibility.
It would have been perceived that the president had taken the side of Mr. Marocha.
Ms. Hogan, may I refer you to Annexure N? You'll find it on page 370. You will see that it is a letter dated the 9th of November, addressed to you and signed by Mr. Marocha. Are you there?
Do you want me to speak to this letter?
Please, maybe in all fairness to Mr. Marocha, read the contents of the letter and you can comment
Yes.
about what is written there.
On that same day that Mr. Moroka returned to his office, he issued a letter addressed to me and the ESCOM board, and CC'd, obviously, to the board, the executive committee of ESCOM, all managing directors of ESCOM, the minister in the Department of Energy, the portfolio committee in Parliament of Public Enterprises, and the portfolio committee of Energy in Parliament. But it was addressed to me. It said, "Dear Minister, I wish to affirm the following with regard to my status as Chief Executive and Director of ESCOM. 1, I remain the Chief Executive and the Director of ESCOM. 2, the shareholder at the highest level have confirmed that any action regarding my status as Chief Executive and Director of ESCOM must be requested formally and granted by the shareholder. I have affirmed that no request has been formally lodged and none has been granted. 3, I've been told that all unauthorized actions taken by the Board of Directors since the 28th of October 2009 are now rescinded. 4, I am at work in my office in Megawatt Park. 5, everyone should cease and desist from any action or communication that undermines the confidence in ESCOM and demoralizes the employees during this critical time. And 6, as a director, I will fully participate in all board activities." And then it ends off, "In the interest of ESCOM and the country, I am continuing the leadership process that is transparent and collaborative, as well as moving forward with the vision I have outlined and the changes I intend to make to build the ESCOM required for this critical economic developmental stage of our democracy. Yours sincerely, PJ Moroka, the Chief Executive of ESCOM."
This letter was written by Mr. Moroka after the ex-president having said that he has decided that he must return to ESCOM.
Well, my understanding of the shareholder at the highest level, he was referring to the president, yes. And the president confirmed with me that he had given him the permission to return.
Yes. Do you wish to comment further on this letter?
Well, you know, this letter was almost a declaration of independence of the board and of the minister, and saying from henceforth I will only, any action taken against me will have to, or taken in relationship to me will have to be taken with the assent and consent of the president. It was a complete flouting of everything relating to corporate governance in ESCOM or in any company, and a complete arrogance about his position, the board, what he was saying, and you know, it's in this last paragraph. That plan that he had for taking ESCOM forward, which constituted the heart of the criticisms of what the board had, that he will now implement that plan. It was, in effect, a CEO who had gone rogue completely, on the understanding that the president would back him. When I received this letter,
Yes.
the deputy minister and I were completely angered.
I'm sorry, before you proceed, I don't want to disturb your train of thought. Is it your understanding that whatever Mr. Moroka says in his letter he had been told, which it stipulates here, is it your understanding that he seems to say he was told by the shareholder at the highest level, or is your understanding that it might mean he has been told by other sources?
Well, my understanding is that the President confirmed certain aspects of this letter. Firstly, the President had confirmed that Moroka remains a Chief Executive Officer. Now, the second part where he says the shareholder at the highest level, in other words, the President, has confirmed that any action regarding my status as the Chief Executive and the Director of Eskom must be requested formally and granted by the shareholder. Now, which shareholder is he referring to? Is he referring to the President or to me?
Did you get an impression that there might have been private meetings between the President and Mr. Moroka?
Yes, and that impression, it's in paragraph, I forget which paragraph here, but when I was making arrangements through my office for the President to meet with Mr. Moroka, you know, after that Sunday meeting, the housekeepers, because you went through the housekeeper then, the housekeeper said, but Mr. Moroka's already been here.
I think it's paragraph 77 on page 18.
Yeah, paragraph 77. He said, but Mr. Moroka has already met with the President. You know, is he coming again? And I sent an SMS to Mr. Moroka and it said, it appears that this meeting with the President is no longer necessary. And I already did it in good faith. And in his court application, Mr. Moroka then said that I had lied to him, that he needn't go and see the President. So this is all very confusing to me, but it does seem to appear that at some stage, the President did meet with Mr. Moroka, and when the President spoke to me, he confirmed that he had given Mr. Moroka the permission to return to Eskom. Now, you have received Annexure N. What happens? How do you react to the contents of Annexure N? N, yes. As I was saying, the Deputy Minister and I were just completely devastated by this. You know, it was clear that the President had encouraged a CEO to believe that he was above company law, above corporate governance, and only saw himself as personally accountable to the President.
And did this letter, as you understand it, mean that, according to Mr. Moroka, any disciplinary action, for example, against him would have to be sanctioned by the President?
Yes.
Okay.
So that, you know, it was out of the hands of the board, it was now. And then the defiance. I will continue with my strategic plan, even though the board is unhappy with it, I will continue, regardless of the board. Now, Chair, I had already gone through the previous months, June, July, August, September, with matters relating to Mr. Gama in that same year. And I had previously experienced how the President saw his role. We then come to an issue with the CEO of Eskom. And the President goes further than he did with Mr. Gama, and he actually just installs someone in the position as CEO, does not even consult with me. And my view at that point was that my executive authority had been completely taken away by the President. I did not see my way clear of that, what was to happen in the future. And I was of the view that because I no longer enjoyed the confidence of the President or could exercise my responsibilities as a minister, that I should resign. I thought that I should address Parliament because as a Cabinet Minister, I am accountable to Parliament.
Now, before you proceed, just in terms of timelines, just help us there. Are you now talking as around the time of the ESCOM issue, or are you talking in terms of an earlier time? Thinking of addressing Parliament?
I'm talking about the cumulative effects of the President's behavior throughout that whole year. And you know, there are other things which I didn't bring to the Commission because I can talk a lot about all sorts of other things. But the ESCOM situation finally crystallized to me the extent to which the President himself would just assume authority on which he did not have the authority, but would just act outside of his broad mandate. And I decided that I would resign. I made arrangements to go to Parliament. I requested of the Speaker.
I'm sorry. I know you would like to tell us at this stage this, but I'm trying to make sure that my interruption doesn't put Mr. Mokoena into a problem in terms of what he wants.
Not at all.
I asked you a question at a time when he had asked you a question about what happened after this letter, and you had begun to tell us that you had a discussion with your deputy. Then I asked you a question. After my question, you had answered my question. Then you began to tell us about how you were feeling. So maybe you should first finish.
Well, that's what I am doing. I'm
that's what you are
responding
doing.
to Advocate Mokoena's leading.
Okay, no, that's fine. That's
on
fine.
what did I do afterwards.
Yes.
So I then decided to resign. I requested formally of the Speaker for a slot in Parliament. The reason why I did that is that firstly, a minister is accountable to Parliament. But secondly, my experience of what was happening filled me with a foreboding of what would come. And I felt that it was necessary that in my going, I at least give an alert of how the President was exercising his authority to the country at large. And this is not an easy thing to do, but you try as a cabinet minister, and I saw many cabinet ministers, you will protect a president, you will defend a president, because a president is often under attack for all sorts of reasons. You don't act without integrity on that. But it was my view at that stage that the President was showing very unfortunate signs of imposing his authority without due consideration of his office and of the constitutional framework in which we operated. And I felt it was necessary to do that. Anyway, what in effect happened, do you want me to go on?
Yes.
The Deputy Minister was also enraged, and he then went to Luthuli House.
This is now after
I didn't go down to Cape Town yet.
After you had discussed with your deputy the letter Annexure N that came from Mr. Maroga.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he was enraged. And he knew that there was a meeting taking place of the senior office bearers, and he went and he requested permission to address, as I understand it, and he presented them with this letter from Mr. Moroka and said, "Do you see what you have done?" to the president. I then received a call from the president. No, Mr. Moroka then received a telephone call from the president to say that he must vacate that office immediately and that he would only go back on my authority. Mr. Moroka then vacated his office, and I went down to Parliament to make a public statement about the position of the CEO of Eskom.
Before Mr. Moroka vacated the office, did Mr. Yunus Sheikh play any role in these issues?
Yes. Mr. Yunus Sheikh had been appointed, he's a labor lawyer, and has done extensive work with the CCMA as a mediator. And in Minister Alec Irwin's time, he acted as a labor advisor to the ministry and the department on labor-related matters. And when I was there, he was dealing with a grievance from a particular employee arising from a time before me. And when all of this first started up at the, when Mr. Moroka first denied that he had resigned, the Director General at the time suggested that we bring in Mr. Sheikh because of his labor expertise. And I can confirm in 2010, Mr. Sheikh and other people via the CCMA managed to resolve some very serious labor disputes, both in Eskom and in Transnet. So I can confirm that. So we briefed Mr. Sheikh, the DG briefed Mr. Sheikh, and his view was that he was quite horrified. And his view at that point was that the president had disregarded all protocols on corporate governance. And he undertook, because of he knew the president, to speak to the president and try and persuade the president that, this was not acceptable. And he would on occasion phone me and, talk about what he was trying to achieve. Anyway, at that point, we had to now discuss Mr. Moroka's departure from Eskom. This wasn't going to be any now that, Mr. Moroka will come back in disciplinary proceeding. This had been a total flouting of authority. And the president was aware that this was taking place, and I requested the acting chair of Eskom, Mr. Paul Makwana, to meet with Mr. Moroka and with Mr. Sheikh to negotiate an exit package. Mr. Makwana later gave evidence in court that he'd been informed that Lakela Kaunda from the president's office would be present. I'm not sure. She wasn't present. But there was a three-way thing. Mr. Moroka, myself, the president, and of course Mr. Sheikh and Eskom. And after they had met, I received a report from Mr. Makwana, the chair, to say that they had met for several hours with Mr. Moroka. Mr. Moroka simply refused to accept any notion that he should exit, any discussion on an exit package. I understand that Mr. Sheikh lost his temper at that point and said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" etc., with apologies for language. And Mr. Moroka, and then the negotiations ceased. And it was then, I then announced that Mr. Moroka, his resignation had been accepted and he had left ESCOM in Parliament.
But he left ultimately. Mr. Maroga left ESCOM ultimately.
Yes, he left. He then phoned me, it was probably the next day, to ask me when I was going to allow him to return. And I said, there's not that possibility. Yeah.
And this was around what date now?
This was around,
His letter is 9 November.
yes, I addressed Parliament on the 12th of November, so it must have been the 10th and the 11th. And it must have been around the 11th of November. We could get the exact date from the court records.
Now, when you announced that in Parliament that he had resigned, was that because were you basing that on the alleged resignation, offer to resign that the board had said it had accepted, or was the position that after all the discussions involving Mr. Yunus Sheikh, there was a fresh resignation from him?
I simply said he was no longer CEO, as I recall. I haven't got the speech before me, but that he was no longer the CEO. I didn't want to go into details.
Oh, okay. Or you didn't say he had resigned. You said he is no longer the CEO.
CEO of ESCOM.
Okay, all right.
Yes, and I spoke about the politicization of boardrooms in my speech. Incidentally, I had requested that the president be present when I gave that speech. He was down in Cape Town at that point, and he did not make himself available, but the deputy president sat there.
Do you know as to who was appointed after Mr. Maroga has left?
Then later, Mr. Brian Damas, who was a senior manager at ESCOM, he was also a nuclear engineer, but long time in ESCOM, was appointed as the CEO. But in the interim, I requested and was allowed to appoint Mr. Makwana as both the chair and the acting CEO. It's not good ever to have the conflation of those two roles. And my view at that time was that ESCOM had gone through a severe crisis. No one knew who was a manager, no one knew who could give authority on anything. It was totally bewildering in the staff, and there was all rumors and things flying around. And Mr. Makwana is an exceptionally calm man with a huge amount of gravitas and integrity. And I felt more than ever he needed to hold that organization together, to see it through a very rocky time. And that his stint as a director of ESCOM for a fair amount of time had enabled him to understand what was necessary going forward. And he very, very graciously accepted to do that, and that's a huge task, to try and bring calm and stability back to an organization that had been thrust into crisis, and I will always be grateful to him for the role that he played.
Now, Ms. Hogan, you have also testified, you have now testified about what you referred to as improper and irregular interferences in relation to the appointments of the boards and the CEOs of the SOEs, with reference to Transnet and ESCOM. Now, how does SAFCOL, SAFCOL, feature within that?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Issues
Before you start on that, can we go back a little bit? You began to say that after your deputy had gone to Luthuli House with the letter from Mr. Maroga, you received a call from the president. But if I recall correctly, before you could tell us what that what the president said to you, you jumped to saying the president called Mr. Marocha. You understood that he had called Mr. Marocha and said what he said. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, you didn't complete the picture by telling us what the president said to you.
My apologies for that. The president did call me afterwards and said that he had instructed Mr. Marocha to vacate the position, and that he had told Mr. Marocha that he would only go back on my authority.
Thank you.
Yes. Now, before you also go to self-call, can we clarify something on paragraph 85? 85.
85.
On
Sorry?
page 19.
19, on page 85.
Just to complete the picture about Mr. Gotzel, what then
Yes.
happened about him?
After the discussions had been finished with Mr. Marocha, Mr. Sheikh also phoned me to give, an account. The chair at first phoned me of Eskom. And in that, he said he had reported back to the president, and the president had said to him that I should consider requesting Mr. Gotzel to come back into the position as chair. We all know that Mr. Gotzel is a long-standing businessman with a huge amount of executive experience and board experience and knowledge. On those grounds, I then contacted Mr. Gotzel and I said this had been a request, and he said he'd like to think about it. I saw in the media that the president denied later on that he had made that request of me. Mr. Mantashe contacted me and said that Mr. Gotzel must not be asked back, and he put it as crudely, if a black guy's got to go, then the white guy must also go. And the president then phoned me and said that Mr. Gotzel must not come back. I pointed out that Eskom would now have an acting chair. And once again, there was no response to that.
Yes.
When Mr. Mantashe spoke to you and said if the black guy goes, the white guy must also go, this was at a time when you had already conveyed to Mr. Gotzel the president's request that he should come back. Did you then have to go back to
I had
Mr.
to.
Gotzel?
It was extremely embarrassing. But Mr. Gotzel appreciated the fact that if the president did not have confidence in him, it would be futile for him to go back. That's not a way to treat, once again I say, that's not a way you treat members of a board and the chair of a board. COSATU issued a statement in support of Mr. Gotzel, and said that he'd been one of, and spoke of him in very praiseworthy terms. So this wasn't, pressure from the Tripartite Alliance or whatever. I don't know what did that, but I was grateful to Mr. Gotzel for his understanding, but extremely embarrassed.
Yes.
But of course, the fact that the president asked you to ask Mr. Gotzel to return as chair can't be an indication that the president did not have confidence in Mr. Gotzel.
No, what was conveyed to me by Mr. Sheikh was that the president had requested it. The president later denied it, as I saw in media, and the president phoned me and said Mr. Gotzel must not come back as a chair. He had in effect resigned, and he should stay resigned.
Yes. And then you had to speak to Mr. Gotzel a second time about the latest developments. Okay, all right, thank you.
I take it that by nodding, you're saying yes to the chairperson's question.
Oh, yes, sorry, thanks.
Now, what seemed to confuse me a little, Ms. Hogan, about this testimony is the last sentence on paragraph 85, where you say that Gwede Mantashe made a similar demand that we have not clarified. But the second portion, you are saying that although during this entire episode, he had made it quite clear to me that he did not support what the president was doing. Can you please, elaborate on that and just clarify that issue? Yes.
What I meant there, and I agree it's ambiguous, is that throughout this tussle with Mr. Marocha, Mr. Mantashe was saying, I'm not getting involved with this. I don't agree with what the president is doing, and I'm not getting involved. And he did stay more or less right out of that. There wasn't, the series of statements from the ANC or anything like that. It was only when the issue of Mr. Gotzel came up that he intervened.
Yes.
Well, I guess it may or may not well, it may or may not well be that it was just a suggestion that in the light of what had happened, it might not be good for ESCOM if one of them continued. It might just have been just a suggestion.
It could have been.
Yes.
There might have been real reasons for that.
Well, one might not know what the reasons were for it, for the suggestion that if the one goes, the other must go. But it may well be that it wasn't a bad thing, in the sense that if Mr. Marocha if the final decision had been that Mr. Marocha must continue, the board would have felt very aggrieved and maybe, well, not maybe, I think from what you have told us, certainly Mr. Gotzel would have resigned. Maybe more members of the board would have resigned than just him. And then maybe if Mr. Marocha left and Mr. Gotzel continued in circumstances where it appeared that the two of them had very sharp differences, and maybe that's why there was this big problem. It may be that it would be seen as one of them has won, another one has lost, whereas maybe if you say, look, we don't necessarily say who is right, who is wrong, but just to solve the problem going forward, it might be better to do without both of them. Maybe that might be another way of looking at it.
It's hypothetical, certainly. Another way of looking at it, too, is that Mr. Gotzel had resigned.
No, that's true,
and
yes.
So then to ask him to come back might have been problematic.
Yeah. Thank you.
On page 20 of your witness statement, from paragraph 88 to page 21, paragraph 92, you are dealing with the issues relevant to SAFCOL. Can you please take us through those issues and explain to us how they are relevant to the improper interferences that you have testified about thus far?
Yes. SAFCOL is a South African Forestry Company Limited. During the period of restructuring and whatever, a large amount, a wide area of forests that belonged to the South African government was sold off. And SAFCOL is a small component of a larger component.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I don't make the mistake that I made earlier on in regard to the ESCOM issue. Can you just confirm in terms of timelines, when is this SAFCOL issue happening?
This is now happening in 2010.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. This is closer to the time that I was removed.
September,
Yes,
September
yes.
2010.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is when I was trying to get the Transnet cabinet memorandum through and a SAFCOL memorandum.
This was before the offer to Finland.
It was?
Before the offer to Finland.
Yes. Yes, before I was going to go off to Finland, yes. I submitted a cabinet memorandum for the AGM of SAFCOL was due on the 28th of September. So I submitted a cabinet memorandum in anticipation of that to be able to appoint a board to SAFCOL at the annual general meeting. And I'd been informed by the Cabinet Secretariat that the President wanted to discuss certain matters before it goes to the subcommittee relating to both Transnet and to SAFCOL. I spoke to the President telephonically, and the President wanted the CV and more understanding of the person I was appointing as the chair of SAFCOL. So I sent 2 letters to the President confirming our telephonic conversation and attaching the CVs of candidates for chair of Transnet and of SAFCOL.
Will those letters be Annexure O?
Yes, that's correct.
Before we go to Annexure O, Mr. Chair, I'm informed that it's now lunch adjournment.
Yes.
Yes. No, thank you very much.
Yeah.
We are going to take the lunch adjournment.
Okay.
And we will resume at 2 o'clock. We adjourn.
Thank you.